of the podcast Stay Tuned with Preet from Cafe.
Next Thursday, yes, Thursday, registered Democrats in the state will choose one of the four candidates here tonight for a job that, with Donald Trump as president, many Democrats believe matters more than ever. In alphabetical order by last name, the candidates are Verizon lobbyist and former aide to Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and Andrew Cuomo, Licia Eve; New York City public advocate Letitia James;
Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney; Fordham Law Professor Zephyr Teachout. You can also
go ahead.
You can also watch this debate as it's being live streamed on the Cooper Union's Facebook page and YouTube page, and also on cafe.com.
Sorry for stepping on your line. May it be the last time tonight.
Don't do it again.
Also on stage, also with us on stage to each ask a question in the public interest are leaders of four nonprofit organizations in New York State: Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause, New York; Caroline Nagy, Deputy Director for Policy and Research at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods; Yan Keo, Fellow at the Century Foundation; and Ndukwe Agwu, Interim Deputy Director for the Consumer and Economic Advocacy Program at the Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation. I did not have time to ask you before we went on whether there's a Legal Services Corporation B.
Thank you, Brian. I also just want... These are the pressing issues we will explore today. It's great to be here. I just want to add my thanks to President Sparks, to Brian Laird. It's an honor to host this debate and be up here on the stage with you. The first speech I gave after leaving office, public speech I gave, was on this very stage a year and a half ago. I want to extend a special thanks to the candidates. That's why we're all here in the final debate before the Democratic primary. And I want to say just one quick thing. I honor your commitment to public service and your willingness to put your necks out on the line and go through the difficult political process, and you deserve, I think, a lot of credit for that. Because running for office isn't something everyone has a stomach for. Now, I'm not a journalist, but I hope that as a former law enforcement official in this state, I can add a certain perspective to this evening's discussion that's informed by many years of experience handling some of the issues that are at the forefront of this election. Good luck to all of you.
Here are the rules. Here are the rules for this debate. We'll begin with 1-minute opening statements. Then we'll have rounds of questioning in which the first respondent will get 90 seconds, followed by 1 minute for the rest, and also some open follow-up at the moderator's discretion. There will also be a lightning round of yes and no or short answer questions. No closing statements tonight. So let us begin. The first opening statement, after drawing electronically generated straws, goes to Mr. Maloney.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Preet. It's wonderful to be here. I'm running for Attorney General because Donald Trump is a clear and present danger, because he is a crook and a bigot, and he has a bullseye on New York. And we shouldn't mince words about it, and we should understand the threat to our values and to our state. I also believe that corruption is a top priority for anyone seeking to do this job. We have had a stranglehold on state government for too long, and the next Attorney General should do something about it. I believe I am the candidate with the most experience and the best qualifications to do this work. I've been in very tough fights, beating the Republicans at the ballot box, on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, and in court. And I look forward to discussing the issues with you tonight and serving as the next Attorney General of New York.
Ms. James.
Thank you. First, let me thank Professor Sparks, Dr. Sparks, and I want to thank Brian. I want to thank, obviously, Preet Prahara, and I know most of you are here because of Preet Prahara. So none of us are, We're in a pivotal moment in the history of this country, careening towards chaos and confusion in the midst of a constitutional crisis. And what we need now more than ever is an experienced Attorney General, someone with a track record of experience, legislative experience, policy experience, and a love for the law. As a former public defender, as a former assistant attorney general, as a former city council member, and now as the public advocate of the city of New York, all of those requirements are in the depth and breadth of my 20-year work. In addition to that, we need an attorney general given the abuses and the corruption coming from Washington, D.C., and the corruption coming from Albany. But we also need to focus on the issues that a lot of New Yorkers care about: consumer fraud, student debt, environmental racism, environmental hazards, We also need to focus on housing and the crisis in affordable housing and reproductive rights for women. The law has been the firmest pillar of our democracy, and right now our democracy is under attack. And when you're under attack, as I have consistently said, you've got to stand up and you've got to fight back. But you've got to fight back with a leader. And that's me.
Thank you. Ms. Teachout.
Good evening. Thank you so much to Preet and to Brian, to all the panelists, to all of you here, and to all of you listening. And it is a great honor to be here in the Great Hall. We are at a true crisis moment in our democracy where the Donald Trump administration is regularly assaulting the very rule of law. And the New York Attorney General's office is one of the most important legal offices in the entire country to both resist and present an alternative to what's happening at the federal level. I am uniquely qualified for this position for three main reasons. First, I'm an anti-corruption expert. I have spent my life battling corruption and have been involved in the legal fight against Donald Trump since the moment he took office. Second, I'm independent. I'm not tied to political party bosses. That'll allow me to take on the corruption in Albany, which is also a real problem in our state. And third, I don't take any corporate money.
And we'll come back. I'm going to keep this to about a minute.
Thank you.
And we will come back, obviously, to more. And Ms. Eve, your opening statement.
Good evening. My name is Licia Eve, and I am running for Attorney General as the most qualified, most prepared candidate to take on the challenges we are facing right now. I've got what it takes to be a fierce and effective advocate for all New Yorkers, because I know how to not just fight, but how to win. My roots in this state run deep. I've got more courtroom experience. No one else is even close. More courtroom experience across the state than any other candidate in this race. And I have an unmatched record fighting in the trenches for social justice for more than 25 years. As a young lawyer, barely 30 years old, I took on the Washington, D.C. prison system on behalf of hundreds of incarcerated women. One of my clients had her legs shackled to a hospital bed as she brought a child into this world. So we filed suit, and we won. So when I talk about being a champion for women, for the vulnerable, for those living in fear, in the shadows, when I talk about being both an independent voice and the person who's got the litigation chops to fight and win against corruption, for me it is not rhetoric, and it is certainly not a classroom exercise. I have done it, and I will do it as Attorney General. Thank you.
Thank you all for your opening statements. For the many people just getting interested in this race in the week before the primary, and Ms. James, you'll get the first response on this. People hear Attorney General and they think prosecutor and law enforcement, like your local DA, but you're all better known for your progressive politics generally as policymakers and advocates. There are many progressive Democrats who wish there was a job for all four of you right now. So for each of you, why, other than the Trump administration, do you want to be a prosecutor rather than a policymaker at this point in your careers, and why should voters care about this job? Ms. James.
Because we become the laughingstock of this nation. Over the last 10 years, 30 elected officials have engaged in the perp walk, primarily because of Preet Bharara. And so it's really critically important that we restore integrity and confidence into public service. I entered into public service because it transformed my life, and I've recognized and realized the power of government. In addition to that, I've crisscrossed the state. I've been to Buffalo, where children, unfortunately, are being poisoned by lead. In Hoosick Falls, the water is being poisoned. Long Island Sound, they're dumping. In Brentwood, Dix Hills, environmental racism, infrastructure, fracking. And so we've got a number of issues. Been to Albany recently, where 8 black men were murdered. And in New York City, we've got a housing crisis. And unfortunately, nothing is being done to address the overwhelming crisis in affordable housing. And we've got zombie homes all over the state of New York, and student debt, and services that are violating the rights of consumers. And so, yes, we need to focus on Donald Trump and his abuses, because too many immigrants tonight are hiding in the shadow, hiding from government. And that's just not the America that I know. That's not the values that I believe in. And so what we need is an attorney general who lives and breathes the law, and who understands and who has tasted and faced discrimination, and recognizes that we've got to stand up and use the power of the law and tell this president and every other individual that no one is above the law and no one is below the law.
Thank you. Ms. Teachout.
Thank you. There are two things that I want to focus on in this answer. First is the crisis of corruption that we have in Albany. I was outspoken when the Moreland Commission was shut down, and we need to actually clean house in New York State. We cannot afford to continue to have crisis after crisis of corruption, and that's going to take a truly independent attorney general. Second, it's not just Donald Trump. We actually have, as you know, today, a changing judiciary. And what that means is that the New York State Attorney General is going to have to be at the front lines, the regulator of last resort for protecting our air and water, our consumer rights, our civil rights, our voting rights. We are going to be facing new and complex legal challenges that we have not faced before. And my deep expertise and understanding of the law across the board is part of the reason I got the endorsement of the New York Times, the Daily News, and today the Buffalo News.
Thank you very much. Ms. Eve.
I'm the daughter of one of the greatest public servants this state has ever known, someone who walked into the Attica prison riots during the riots when I was 7 years old, the first person to walk through, not knowing whether he would come out alive. And one of the things that my father taught me is that, Licia, like it or not, government affects pretty much every part of our lives. And that's why you should care who your attorney general is. Yes, you need a fierce, experienced New York lawyer, not someone who decided to join the bar 2 weeks ago. You need an experienced advocate to fight against Donald Trump and all that he is trying to do to undermine our rights. But we have a lot of issues in this state that are on us. Our horrific criminal justice system that treats black and brown and poor white people differently than everybody else, that predates Donald Trump. That is on us. And as Attorney General, I will lead the way to make this state more just and more fair for everyone. The fact that so many New York children do not have the kind of educational opportunity that I had as a daughter of this state and who went to public school in this state violates their state constitutional rights to a sound basic education.
And I'm going to have to cut in there. Thank you.
We have so many issues we have to address, and that is why you should care who your next Attorney General will be.
Thank you. Mr. Maloney.
Well, I hope what people know about me when they ask who's Sean Patrick Maloney is they know for 25 years I've been working as an investigative lawyer, as someone who's done real legal work, who's negotiated major transactions, somebody who spent 3 years in the White House senior staff, 2 years in the governor's office, now 6 years in Congress, where I have fought for progressive values every step of the way and won big fights. And this is a big fight. I'm the first openly gay person ever elected to Congress. I have an interracial family. My husband is here tonight. We were together for 22 years before we could get married. We have 3 kids who are African American and Latino, and I won in a Trump district. Don't tell me Democrats can't win everywhere. I do it for a living. And the fact is that right now Democrats aren't winning enough. So when you ask why I want to be in this job instead of Congress, what I say is that Democrats need to get on offense and get off defense. I am sick of the Democratic Party being scared of its own shadow. I think we can do more, and I think we can win in tough districts again, and we can stand for something again, but we better be willing to take some risks and to speak from the heart. And this is a job where we can do more. This is the front line right now of the resistance, and you want somebody who's been in tough fights, and that's who I am.
Thank you, and thank you all on that round. Preet has the next question.
Thank you, Brian. As Attorney General, if you are elected, you will have enormous power, and people have a right to know how you will use that power. Just opening an investigation can destroy your reputation, ruin a livelihood, influence an election. Literally, just opening the case. So I want to ask each of you, what is your view of the proper basis required to start an investigation of a person or a corporation or a nonprofit? How much smoke, if any, does there need to be? And how do you guard against a rush to judgment against someone, whether it's an average unknown New Yorker or Donald Trump and his associates? And this question is for Ms. Eve to begin.
Actually, I think Ms. Teachout to
Teachout.
begin.
Thank you for the question. There are enormous powers in this office, and they must be used judiciously. And that requires, then, relying on a broad array of information that is coming from the public. Our news organizations are essential sources of information to begin to learn what is already happening. And I will say, in the case of Donald Trump, for instance, we already know indisputably that he is violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution. The emoluments clause of the Constitution forbids foreign governments from giving money to federal officers. In a case like that, where there's no factual dispute, I feel quite comfortable calling that out. In other cases, you'll see newspaper reports, reports from private citizens, and reports that come from the knowledge that your office is doing good work, that then create more and more information coming to the office. And in those cases, a preliminary investigation and then a full investigation is warranted. I take your question to be in part about how we deal as candidates and as the next Attorney General with, in particular, Donald Trump and the threats we see from his administration. And we already know from reading the newspaper that there's enough smoke there to be investigating his businesses here in New York. And I see the Attorney General's role in New York as really critical for preserving the integrity of the businesses in New York, the foundation, which is also based here in New York, the beating heart of the Trump organization here in New York, and feel quite comfortable that there's enough basis right now to begin an investigation.
Thank you. Ms. Eve.
The question is critically important because, as you noted, the broad powers and the jurisdiction that the Attorney General has. It's critically important that there be a fact-based analysis. Sometimes it'll be unequivocally clear. As was mentioned, a foundation whose board of directors hasn't met in 19 years, you don't have to do a whole lot of fact-finding to make a determination that there's something awry here. In other instances, you'll have to rely upon, I would look at what are some of the press reports, what are some of everyday New Yorkers saying, and then conduct potentially a preliminary inquiry and have a conversation with the nonprofit or the persons who I think may warrant additional investigation. And in some instances, it's unequivocally clear. India Cummings, a 27-year-old African-American woman taken into custody in the Erie County Holding Center, dies on the floor of the jail in her own urine and own vomit. I don't need a lot of investigation to know that what happened to her shocks the conscience, and that as Attorney General, it should be investigated. And if the investigation leads to prosecution, I will hold every single person who is responsible for her death to account.
Thank you. Mr. Maloney?
Well, obviously you want to take a fact and evidence-based approach. I think it's very important when you're managing a large office like this, and I'm probably the one on the stage with the most management experience of significant organizations, is to understand that you have limited resources and understand, therefore, the magnitude of the harm that you'd be addressing and the quality of the evidence you have at the outset for why you would devote those resources against that harm. I do think it's maybe easier to do this question by subtraction than addition, meaning I can tell you clearly what isn't right. What isn't right is to allow a political motive into this calculation. What isn't right is to allow an ideological motive. What isn't right is to allow some press hit or some future campaign for some bigger office. I think we've seen enough of that in the Attorney General's office. I think it'd be great if we gave the people in New York 4 years without a bunch of ego and without a bunch of scandal. And I think that maybe doing the damn job ought to be the standard for the next Attorney General and staying out of trouble. And not throwing around charges in this campaign designed for a short-term political pop, whether you're talking about law enforcement or you're talking about this administration, that you can't back up. I do think Donald Trump has provided ample evidence for a number of very important inquiries, particularly the state equivalence of what is happening at the federal level, and we ought to have a senior official of this office dedicated to backstopping the federal activity, and I'm sure we can get into that more, because I do think, like my colleagues, Donald Trump has demonstrated an extraordinary level of venality, and the AG should be in that game.
Thank you. Ms. James.
We should all follow the example of Barbara Underwood. Following the facts and following the evidence. And I'm so glad that my opponents now agree with me that when you file a lawsuit, one should be judicious. Whether it's the Martin Act, the Donnelly Act, deceptive business practices, consumer law, it's really critically important that everyone understand, as was mentioned by Mr. Bahara, that filing a lawsuit, simply opening up an investigation, can ruin lives. And so with respect to Donald Trump, we need to follow his money. We need to find out where he's laundered money. We need to find out whether or not he's engaged in conspiracy and whether or not he's colluded not only with Putin, but also with China as well. We all know that 10 years ago he was almost bankrupt. Most domestic banks were not lending him any money. Where did he get all of the money to purchase his real estate holdings and all of his golf courses? And all of those transactions have happened here in New York City, which is why the next Attorney General is absolutely critical. And the next Attorney General will be someone who will be wearing high heels.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. James. Can I just ask one very quick follow-up, just a few seconds from each of you? A lot of you mentioned Donald Trump. You've been mentioning Donald Trump in your campaigns. And part of the spirit of the question was to find out from you, notwithstanding there being some smoke with respect to some aspects of what this president has done in his private business, there are cases that have been brought, cases that's pending on the part of the Attorney General's office itself. But is anyone on this panel saying that because there's some evidence in some area, or some smoke in some area, that means that without more, that every single business, associate, organization that is in any way affiliated with Donald Trump is ripe for investigation without more?
Well, I certainly didn't suggest that. I started off by saying that it should be a fact-based analysis, and I mentioned a particular fact having to do with the Trump Foundation, a foundation that should be meeting regularly, as any charitable organization should, and one that hasn't met in all the 20 years, and that we know for a fact that charitable funds were used for non-charitable purposes. So in that instance, the facts are really pretty much unequivocally clear in terms of an alleged violation of state law. But I do believe we need to be judicious, and listen, I understand that. As the most experienced litigator on this stage, well, at least among the candidates, not more experienced than you, Preet, but certainly as the most experienced litigator, having litigated in federal and state courts across the state, and with my first job out of Harvard Law School, clerking for a judge for 2 years on the state's highest court. So I understand and appreciate very much your question.
Anyone else quickly?
Yeah, I just want to mention, for instance, it's not mere association. It is particular facts that we have seen reported that warrant investigation. For instance, the recent Michael Cohen plea raised lots of questions about the relationship between the campaign, the foundation, and the organization. And there have been other facts that are similarly raised questions about the campaign, the foundation, and the organization, but they're very particular facts, not just a broad brush.
There's at least 100 inquiries into his transactions, but the ones that obviously individuals are focused on is the Mueller investigation, the Southern District, the Attorney General, and also the FBI. Those are the investigations which obviously are closing the walls in on Donald Trump. So it's really critically important that we not just talk about association, that we talk about his transactions, and more importantly, that we talk about the Trump Foundation and the organization as a whole.
Mr. Miller, you want to round it out quickly?
Well, sure. Preet, I was going to say, of course, you're not going to want to assume every organization associated with the president is corrupt. I'm just having trouble thinking of an organization associated with the president that is not corrupt. I'm sure there might be one. Maybe he gave a speech at the Boy Scouts or something at one point, but I'm only half joking. I mean, when you look at Trump University, I think you'd agree that's a cesspool. I think when you look at the Trump Foundation, I think you'd agree that there's clear evidence of self-dealing in the president's own handwriting, and thank God for Barbara Underwood bringing that case right now. We've seen what the Trump Organization has done. We've seen what the Trump campaign did. We've seen what the Trump White House is doing. I mean, so my goodness, if ever there has been a pattern of venality and deceit and corruption, this president is defining it every day. And I do think we shouldn't get too caught up in the minutiae there. This is a clear and present danger to our country and our Constitution, to our national security, and to our values in New York, and we should stand up to it.
Thank you.
Listeners, if you're just joining us on the radio, you're listening to the Democratic Attorney General candidates debate in advance of next Thursday's New York State primary day. I'm Brian Lehrer with Preet Bharara, your moderators. The candidates are, in reverse alphabetical order this time, Zephyr Teachout, Sean Patrick Maloney, Letitia James, and Licia Eve. Our next question, with Ms. Eve getting the first response, will come from Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause New York and Let New York Vote.
Good evening. New York's voters find it difficult to cast their ballots because of antiquated voting laws that favor political parties over voters. Common Cause New York and the Let New York Vote coalition are working to change that. But while we work to bring early voting, same day and automatic voter registration and pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds to New York, our experience with the New York Votes Act of 2016, which was introduced by Attorney General Schneiderman, shows that the Attorney General alone cannot change our election law. Miss Eve, if you were the next Attorney General, how would you use the current powers of the office to protect New Yorkers' right to vote, a protection which is guaranteed by our state constitution?
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for that question and for your leadership. This is an issue that I have been working on for many years since I served as the first Senate Counsel and Homeland Security Advisor to Hillary Clinton, working with Common Cause and many voting rights and civil rights organizations across New York and across the nation to craft the Count Every Vote Act, which the New York Times not only talked about but editorialized as a gold standard for election reform. As you probably recall, Susan, it had felon reenfranchisement for the nation, early voting for the nation, no excuse absentee balloting for the nation. We have some of the worst voting laws in the country, and that is one of the reasons why we have so few people participating in the process. And I know everybody in this room is from the New York City metro area, but there are millions of New Yorkers across this state who live in rural counties who cannot have a chance to vote until 6 hours after everybody else does, because their population is fewer than 250,000 people in the county. Shame on us. Shame on us. We have led so many ways. We've led the suffrage movement. We've led the civil rights movement. We're a state of abolitionists. We need to be leading and having the best voting laws in the nation and not the worst. I bring to this experience and to this role an unmatched expertise with respect to voting laws. And as the Attorney General, I will leave no stone unturned to use the bully pulpit and use all the tools available to get the legislature to do what is right for New Yorkers and give them the best, not the worst voting laws in the nation.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Susan.
We're going to give you a chance to answer.
I'd be happy to oblige. And thank you for all the work you've done over so many years on so many issues important to good government in New York. You've done extraordinary work, and I'm well aware of it. One of the most wonderful things about being in Congress, and there aren't a lot, but one of them is serving with John Lewis. And I'll tell you, I had an opportunity to bring my two little girls down to Selma, Alabama, for the 50th anniversary of the March Across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where Mr. Lewis nearly lost his life fighting for voting rights. And a short while later, we were back in Washington, and we were in the cloakroom, and it was the day that the Supreme Court struck down a part of the Voting Rights Act. And he said to me, little brother, And that's how he speaks. But he said, little brother, I was standing next to the desk when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in August of 1965, and if you told me that 48 years later we'd still be fighting for that, I would not have believed it. And he said, it's going to fall to people like you and younger people to pick up that baton and carry on that fight, because some of us almost lost our lives trying to get it in the first place. And that is the spirit we need to bring to this issue. We are Democrats. We have our faults. We have never been afraid to let people vote. And that is the difference between us and the other guys. We see them trying to suppress the vote because they're afraid of the voters. And what would also help in this state is if the Democratic Party didn't try to select candidates, it let the voters elect candidates. And that would be nice too.
I'm confident that when the New York State Senate turns blue in September, in a week from today, that the package of bills that unfortunately has been held up in the state Senate because of incumbency protection will pass. It includes early voting, early registration. It includes making sure that we have more access to voting. It includes, again, ensuring that individuals who are disabled are allowed to vote in the state of New York. And it includes also allowing some immigrants to vote in the state of New York. More individuals need to vote in the state of New York, and we need to make it easier and not continue to put up roadblocks in the state of New York. It's really critically important. And the fact that Section 3 was struck down from the Voting Rights Act obviously is a concern to me. As someone who has stood up and defended the Voting Rights Act, particularly in central Brooklyn, it's really critically important that we protect every aspect of the voting rights law going forward, and that we make sure that we make it easier for individuals to vote, particularly individuals who are disenfranchised and marginalized groups in the state of New York. More people need to vote. And lastly, the federal date and the state date need to be combined. The fact that there's a federal primary in June doesn't make any sense. It's a loss of taxpayer dollars. It's a waste of taxpayers' dollars. And we all need to vote on the same day. And I urge the state legislature to act.
So, last question, and then moderators, may I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, but Zephyr Teachout gets a response to this too.
The right to vote is the right upon which all other rights depend. And I am a voting rights expert, deeply steeped in these laws. Yes, we must push for greater legislation, including early voting. 37 states have early voting. New York does not. In fact, North Carolina used New York as an example when defending its own racist voter suppression laws, saying that at least they weren't as bad as New York's. But there are very practical things that, as Attorney General, I can and will do. The last Attorney General was critical in suing after the voter purges in Brooklyn. We need to be on the front lines protecting the right to vote at the polls in the general election and in the primary. I talk to too many people who do not trust the security of what is happening at the polls. And we need to be involved, as I already have been involved, working with leaders around the country in this litigation, on litigation against partisan gerrymandering, based on the importance of the equal right to vote. I'm the only...
Sorry for time.
Okay.
But Susan, you wanted to ask a follow-up?
I did, because I'm afraid not all of the candidates answered the question that was asked. So let me give you another chance, and let me ask you, what criteria would you use to determine whether a complaint or complaints about conduct at a polling place or around an election warrants an investigation by your office if you're elected?
Well, I would look, first of all, at, again, what the facts are. We need to have more poll monitors so that we can, in real time, objectively assess what is happening on election day at the voting booths. Had we had more monitors, we probably would have discovered the disaster that was so anti-democratic that took place in Brooklyn not too many years ago. So we need to have greater oversight, greater monitors, and if there is one instance, obviously that is probably not sufficient to warrant an investigation by the Office of Attorney General. But many instances, particularly in particular boroughs and in particular communities, that reflect a systemic failure to ensure that we all are able to exercise our constitutional right to vote, I without question would conduct an investigation.
Sean Patrick Malone?
Yeah, Mr. Lerner, I think that you're not going to find a lot of daylight between us on this. Obviously, you're going to want to have some sort of interference or intentional interference with a voter's franchise. I guess what some of us are trying to get at is that it is at least as serious an issue that the industrial scaled voter suppression that we see by the Republican Party, the systematic disenfranchisement of people in New York with this shell game of primary dates, with these incumbent favoring laws. That's where the real democracy is dying, ma'am. And so my point to you is that we will go hammer and tong at the individual voter who is disenfranchised. You bet. That is wrong, and it deserves our attention. Right. But if you want to do this at scale, then I would look at the laws the Republican Senate is blocking that will bring much better democracy.
We get plenty of complaints about misconduct by Democrats in polling places.
Amen.
James,
yeah.
your opportunity.
Amen, Susan.
And very briefly, if you will,
Sure.
so we can go to our next rounds.
Susan, I believe the Office of Attorney General, that has 1,800 employees and 650 assistant attorney generals, should embed themselves in the Board of Elections right before election and on election day to monitor the activities. I've seen suppression all throughout the state of New York. I've seen it in Brooklyn. I've seen it in the city of New York. It's really critically important that we have independent monitors, and we can do that using the staff of the Office of Attorney General.
Can I just briefly add that this is an area where data and monitoring patterns is really important. So first of all, identifying patterns of reporting. We don't need too many to see a pattern, and making sure that we were responding to those patterns proactively, finding out what we're hearing on the ground, using the techniques that are used, for instance, to track what happens with the spread of disease, to actually learn where we see the spread of voter complaints at the polls.
Susan, let me just say the pattern is already there. There's no need to do data checking. All you need to do is be on the ground. And there's been several reports with respect to suppression of the voter, the right to vote all throughout the state of New York, and particularly in urban centers, and particularly against marginalized and vulnerable populations. And so one has to obviously be on the ground to know what's really happening.
Thank you all
my
very
time is
much.
up. Thank you.
Our next question will come from Caroline Nagy, Deputy Director for Policy and Research at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods.
Good evening. So I believe this question is directed first at Representative Maloney. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of the 2008 foreclosure crisis. Even though a decade has passed, we still have tens of thousands of New Yorkers and their communities statewide that are struggling to avoid foreclosure and also deal with abandoned properties. However, under the Trump administration, we have seen diminished federal oversight of financial institutions, straight-out antagonism towards consumer protections, and legislation that weakens Dodd-Frank. As Attorney General, how specifically will you use your office's enforcement powers to protect New York consumers and hold financial institutions accountable?
Well, it's absolutely critical, and obviously we see a retreat by the federal government in many areas of federal law, where we're used to the federal government being part of the solution, not part of the problem. And this is clearly one of them. I look no further than the effort to kneecap the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by putting Mick Mulvaney in there. That is an unbelievable insult to the people who believe in that agency's work and the design of it, which was to be independent from that kind of interference. Look, I fight every day in the House of Representatives against effort to do bad things. I have been in that fight for years. I will tell you that the biggest mistake we made after the financial crisis was not holding more individuals accountable. I will never understand why nobody went to jail for the financial crisis in 2008. I will never understand it. And I think that it is, and I don't think you have to go on some witch hunt, but my goodness, if the subprime mortgage originators were not engaged in systemic fraud, then I don't know what that looks like. But look, I do think that the Attorney General's office can be part of the solution. I represent the city of Newburgh, where the Attorney General's office works with my office on the land bank program, which is doing terrific work, bringing properties back into commercial viability, helping create affordable housing and ownership for local tenants, local residents, and that's the kind of work this office should continue. But I think that, first and foremost, this office is going to have to step up into the areas where the federal government is stepping back.
Ms. James.
Yes. At its peak in 2008, there were at least 100,000 foreclosure inventory all throughout the state of New York. In 2017 and in 2018, we're still at an all-time high. We're seeing zombie homes all over the state of New York. And what we are seeing is the next crisis around the corner, and that is individuals who service these mortgages. And what we are seeing is individuals, servicers who are not giving forbearance and modification agreements to consumers. What we are seeing is consumers who unfortunately are being charged excessive fees. What we are seeing is consumers who unfortunately their payments are not being credited. And what we are seeing now is an agency on the federal level which unfortunately is rolling back all of the progress that we made under President Barack Obama. And so we've got to harden our system, because tonight in New York City there are over 60,000 New Yorkers who are homeless. And so it's critically important that housing be a major issue of the next Attorney General. And as the public advocate of the city of New York, as most of you know, I have turbocharged the worst landlord list. And I look forward to enforcing the law against worst landlords, but also to strengthening the law so that we can address this foreclosure crisis that we are confronting, and the next crisis, which is right around the corner, which could put our economy in a tailspin.
Thank you for your question and for your work. This is an area I care very deeply about, and I have been in this fight for 10 years. After the financial crisis, almost exactly 10 years to the day, I co-founded a group dedicated to putting more financial criminals in jail, breaking up big banks, ensuring greater financial stability, and pushing for the CFPB. We worked with 250 labor and community organizations, hundreds of hours working to push for what became Dodd-Frank. I do not take any corporate money. And in order to play the critical role, the absolutely central role that the New York State Attorney General must play in protecting against the next financial crisis and ensuring justice today against consumer fraud and consumer ripoffs that are happening right now, it is essential that the next Attorney General not take corporate money. I would use the parens patriae power under Dodd-Frank. I would use the powerful deceptive practices law to battle against consumer fraud, General Business Law 347.
Time, please.
I was just getting started.
Ms. Eve.
I would put the enforcement powers of the Attorney General's office on steroids to continue to hold account anyone who tries to fleece New Yorkers. Secondly, I am proud that one of the people who is supporting my campaign is Anne Frank, the brother of Barney Frank, and I worked with Anne and I worked with Congressman Frank to advance the legislation that we now know as Dodd-Frank. And as Attorney General, I would do my utmost to fight it against any rollbacks of that legislation. There was a reference by Sean to the land banks. I'm proud as the General Counsel of Empire State Development that I helped craft the legislation that is now law that created land banks in our state, and as the first woman and the first person of color to be the Chief Economic Development Advisor to a governor of our state's history, I oversaw the implementation of what has been a very successful land bank program. I believe we need to have more aggressive enforcement of the Community Reinvestment Act, and last but certainly not least, I would put on steroids something that Bob Abrams did as Attorney General, which is to have attorneys generals in the community for a day, and so we could hear directly from New Yorkers who continue to be affected by that crisis and hear firsthand how best we can help address their issues.
All right, and I have a brief follow-up question. So, as you know, many of our financial laws are centered around protecting the rights and interests of shareholders and investors. How will you prioritize victims of corporate misdeeds and members of the general public over investors and shareholders in your enforcement actions?
So it's really critically important that we give private right of actions to individuals in this particular case. But what we have seen all throughout the state of New York is individuals who unfortunately are being subject to deceptive business practices. And so it's really critically important that as the only individual on this panel that actually went after a mortgage company, Delta Funding, when I was an assistant attorney general, and the only one on this panel to get relief for individuals who unfortunately were defrauded by unscrupulous businesses. Primarily those homeowners were black and brown. And what we are seeing is individuals who are black and brown all across the state, and particularly seniors who are being subjected to these scams. It's also important to note that whenever we have any settlement funds, that they not go to the general fund, and that they be used to provide assistance and funds to legal services all throughout the state of New York. It's critically important that individuals have attorneys to represent themselves in both in housing court, in landlord-tenant court, and also in civil court, going after these individuals who unfortunately have affected their most precious possession, and that is their home.
I don't see this as a choice, I see this as both. Two of the most powerful laws, the Martin Act and the Deceptive Practices Law, are essential to this fight, and both are actually really important to use. Using the Martin Act, which is, yes, about deception in the shareholder context, is really critical for preserving financial stability and stopping lawlessness in the financial sector. And oh yes, I am ready to be the next sheriff of Wall Street. But I want to point out this is an area of genuine, real difference. I fought really hard for a section you may not know about, Section 716 of Dodd-Frank, which ensured that the people of this country would not have to bail out big banks for risky behavior. My opponent, Sean Patrick Maloney, was one of a handful of Democrats who voted with Republicans to get rid of that. My opponent was also, Sean Patrick Maloney, was also a Democrat who voted with a handful of Republicans in the recent Bank Lobbyist Act, which, among other things, decreased reporting requirements so we can't know about discrimination in lending.
Mr. Maloney, since you were mentioned by name,
Yeah,
you get a
sure.
response.
Thought you might give me that chance, Brian. Well, you know what a pile of nonsense that is. I mean, I have to tell you, this is like the tale of two Zephyrs. I'm afraid that there's the 2016 Zephyr, who I knew when we were all working to get her elected to Congress, who was running around the Hudson Valley talking about helping small banks and helping folks. You may remember that event up in Ulster where you pledged to help small lenders get credit into the communities. And I don't think she realizes that it was the African American credit unions and the other credit unions and the small and the community banks who said, you are killing us with some of this stuff. And we have lost 70% of our small banks in this country. And we now have 70% of bank assets under management in the hands of 4 institutions. And that legislation was pushed, what you're talking about, what I did, was pushed by the small bankers and the African American credit unions and said, we need breaker, we're going out of business with our compliance costs, with our cybersecurity costs, and that's what that was about. But Zephyr has demonstrated I understand it sounds fun when you're raising money online or you're doing some law school fact pattern, but in the real world, on the floor of the House of Representatives, when you actually win a race and have to decide what you're going to do to stand up to these guys, what you try to do is you try to find areas where you can do some good for the people who really need it. And just like her support of the Uber cap is so insensitive to neighborhoods who have been so underserved, her rhetoric on this is completely unhinged from the reality of who this will help. There wasn't a hair touched on the head of the regulations. There wasn't a hair touched on the head of the regulations that really affect the big banks.
Right.
And that's where we should focus. And I will always stand up for the CFPB and for Dodd-Frank. And one final point. It was Barney Frank and Chris Dodd who also supported these reforms. So I think that's pretty good evidence of what it was doing.
Well, since there's a real difference here, I want to give you, the two of you, another, but so we can move on, the two of you, just another 20-second response on this, Zephyr Teachout.
Yeah. I urge everyone to look up the record, both of the Bank Lobbyist Act, the House version of which Sean Patrick Maloney voted for, along with Republicans, which Barney Frank vehemently opposed.
That's not true.
It is true.
That's not true.
And second,
That's not true.
And second, to look up the 2014 vote. I fought so hard for these core protections. And to be the next sheriff of Wall Street, you need to be willing to stand up to big bank lobbyists, not take corporate money, not take corporate money from big banks, and that is what I will continue to do as your next
Mr.
attorney.
Maloney.
Brian, if I may. That's Great. Listen, that is wonderful. That is wonderful. That is wonderful, and that sounds good. Unfortunately, Zephyr's argument is with herself and with the 2016 Zephyr. I mean, let me tell you something. The front page, the Daily News today reported that Zephyr Teachout took $174,000 of Wall Street money. Today, not some day in the past, today, Zephyr Teachout had to admit that she took tens of thousands of dollars of LLC money when she was trying to get elected governor. And here's the point. I don't question that Zephyr Teachout cares about these issues and is a good person. I have seen the good Zephyr. This is not it. This is the attacked Zephyr that wants to win a political campaign. And here's my point. My point is that I just wish you would give us the same benefit of the doubt. We actually all care about these issues. We are all working in an imperfect system, and we are all trying to do the very best we can. And I know she is a good person, but this is not her best side.
Listeners, this is the Attorney General primary debate on the Democratic side here on WNYC. And after 4 substantive rounds, Preet and I will now ask each candidate a short political question about a possible controversy that voters might find relevant to their decisions, though I think we just got a little preview there. And we're not going to roll the clock on this, but I'm going to try to keep you all pretty short because really we would rather be having our listeners hear about things like foreclosure and voting rights. But just today, Mr. Maloney, Ms. Teachout filed a lawsuit against you with the claim that you have illegally transferred money from your congressional campaign to your Attorney General campaign, in effect surpassing the limits for a campaign contribution. Are you playing fast and loose with the rules and with donors' campaign cash when they thought they were giving for you to stay in Congress?
Wow, okay, look, that lawsuit was brought this afternoon and it was thrown out 9 minutes later. There isn't a lawsuit right now. I am a little surprised you would ask that question, Brian, especially when you and I talked about that and I told you what happened today. You know that's been thrown out. You know a judge laughed that out of court. And the judge set the hearing for October, which tells you something about the judge's sense of humor, because this race is in a week. Zephyr Teachout was called out. Hold on. Zephyr Teachout was called out by the Albany Times-Union as the only one in this race who has improperly used federal funds in her state campaign. Let's be fair. The Albany Times-Union went through this chapter and verse because she was hiding her use of federal funds. And don't take my word for it, folks. She refiled her filing. She did it over a weekend in the dark of night because she was playing this shell game with federal funds. What we did is by the book, and it is chapter and verse and transparent as hell. And I'm going to tell you, I am playing this absolutely by the rules, and I am very happy that the court agreed with us in about 2 seconds flat.
So, Ms. Teachout, what about that if it was agreed with in 2 seconds flat and thrown out or delayed?
That's just simply false. It's simply false. The case is going forward. The court has set a hearing date, set a schedule for when the papers will be filed. And this case is about the campaign finance contribution limits in New York are $21,000. And Sean Patrick Maloney took $1.4 million in an illegal contribution.
Hold on, that is absolutely an outrageous thing to say. Every one of those contributions qualifies under the state limits,
Sean,
and it was Zephyr who took $21,000 from the CEO of Procter & Gamble,
Sean,
right? Like, no, I mean,
Sean,
we can't just make up facts, Zephyr. Come
Ms.
on.
Teachout, go
Sean,
ahead.
and I do think as a lawyer you should know the difference between a case being thrown out and going forward.
Yeah, the injunction. All right.
All right, we are not.
May I just say, what Zephyr was, first of all, you are not going to sue your way to a victory in this race, Zephyr. The voters are going to decide it, number one. Number two, Zephyr has been licensed to practice law in New York for, I believe, a week. And during that week, she has lost her first and only lawsuit because she was seeking an injunction, which the judge denied, and
right.
with a terrific sense of humor said, come back in October.
Just for equal time, 15 seconds, and then we're going to move on.
Well, I think if it was equal time, I'd get maybe 30. But this is very serious. I take campaign finance violations very seriously. I'm very worried about playing fast and loose with New York laws. And when you are running to be the next Attorney General of New York State, you should not be even close to the line in terms of taking over $1 million in contributions
Zephyr, why did you refile?
against New York law.
Why did you refile your
And-
filings?
Let her finish.
Why did you refile your
And
filings?
I'm happy for all of you to look up the Times Union article. We are in complete
Please do.
compliance and not using any federal
Why did you
All
have
right.
to refile over
We're
the
gonna
weekend?
we're gonna move on to Ms. James.
No, I think that's important, Brian. Why did you have to refile your filings over the weekend? Because you were
We are-
disguising federal funds, right?
Go ahead, answer
You were
the
misusing
question.
federal funds. That's a simple question. She should
we
answer
we
that
are
question.
in complete compliance, and I urge you all to look up the New York Times article. And this is, I'm not going to let this be a distraction from over $1 million spent taken as a
brought it up.
contribution.
Just to be clear, he asked you why did you have to refile? Why did you?
We were making a technical correction. We're totally in compliance. We're
Right.
totally in
That
compliance.
All right,
technical correction was
now I'm
hiding
gonna jump
federal
in
funds,
and
right?
move on.
That's
Ms.
unbelievable
Ms.
hypocrisy, Brian.
Ms. James, the New York Post reports that after shaming the city's worst landlords for years, you are hauling in donations for your Attorney General campaign from developers, management companies, and other real estate interests. It says a Post review of campaign filings shows the real estate industry has donated at least $213,000 to your campaign just since May, nearly 1/5 of your total in the period, and that donors include people linked to the big development firms of Two Trees, Extel, and Steiner, among others. What might these big landlords think they'll get for their investment in you, and why do you accept their money at all?
60% of my donors have contributed $200 or less. If you know anything about Letitia James, you will recognize that I am unbossed and unbought in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm. And the fact is that I have been endorsed by the Democratic Party. And the reality is that I will not be disadvantaged, and I do not want to unilaterally disarm. And as was mentioned earlier, there are individuals who are on this panel. All of my opponents have accepted LLCs in one form or another. And so, the reality is, in order for me to compete, because you recognize that as an African-American woman, I have consistently had a difficult time raising funds. But the reason why I am the public advocate, the reason why I was the city council member, was because of public financing of campaigns, which is why we should support public financing of campaigns on the state level, and so that all of the rules will apply to all individuals. And last but not least, there is not one contributor to my campaign who is on the worst landlord list. In fact, I am proud of the fact that at least 3 of the landlords on my list have been arrested. And it's also critically important that individuals who have supported me in the past and who have endorsed me, I've sued them. I've sued the mayor of the city of New York at least 10 times. He supported me. The governor has supported me, and I've sued him as well. I've sued the previous mayor of the state of New York. And there will be no sunlight between me and the law, because I recognize the power of the law and the power to transform lives. The law changed my life, and the reality is that I'm going to be the next Attorney General of the state of New York, who will be independent, unbossed, unbought, in the spirit and the proud spirit of Shirley Chisholm.
Thank you. Listeners, this is WNYC FM HD and AM New York, WNJT FM 88.1 Trenton, WNJP 88.5 Sussex, WNJY 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO 90.3 Toms River. On New York and New Jersey Public Radio, you are listening to the Democratic Attorney General candidates debate in advance of next Thursday's New York State primary day, with candidates Sean Patrick Maloney, Zephyr Teachout, Licia Eve, and Letitia James. I'm Brian Lehrer with my co-moderator, Preet Bharara, who gets to ask the other 2 candidates political questions now.
Okay. Continuing the fun. This question is for Ms. Eve. Arguably, how one manages one's finances is an indicator of how they would manage the considerable budget of the Attorney General's office. Also arguably an indicator of other things. Your former boss, Andrew Cuomo, said last week, quote, and I don't quote him often, quote, "The release of taxes is how people get a chance to see how you live your life," close quote. All the other 3 candidates have done so. In the interests of transparency and openness, why won't you just release your tax returns?
Well, first of all, I have been extraordinarily transparent and open. I have been through multiple background checks for various roles over the course of the past 20 years, both criminal and civil background checks. I have filled out multiple years, 26-page disclosure forms that laid to all to see the details of my finances. I, in contrast to most of my opponents, have not had a taxpayer-funded job for most of my life. And Ms. James, and I applaud her effort, passed legislation to protect the salary history of persons, particularly women. And so that's the primary reason why I have not disclosed my taxes, but I have now 72 pages of disclosure forms that speak about my assets or lack thereof in detail. I also want to say, because you're talking about finances and you're talking about frankness and transparency, and I've heard Zephyr say this over and over and over again, and I just can't take it anymore. You have said, Zephyr, too many times to count, that you don't take corporate money, but that simply is not true. You took tens of thousands of dollars in LLC money when you ran for governor. You took millions of dollars of funds from political action committees when you moved from Brooklyn to Hudson Valley and then 10 months later decide to run for Congress. And the person you oppose for governor right now, you willingly accepted his endorsement 2 years ago because it was politically expedient for you to do so. So I believe you ought to be transparent and just acknowledge what the facts actually are.
Just a moment. I appreciate the pivot from the question about your taxes to something else. But if I... And I think Ms. Teachout should have a chance to respond. But if I could just ask one quick follow-up. Did you, because a lot of people suggested this, did you ever suggest during the presidential campaign period or since that Donald Trump should have released his tax returns in connection with running for president?
I believe I may have said that, I can't remember, but when he was the nominee, I may have said that as the nominee of his party, that he should release his taxes. I may have said that.
Okay, if you want to take a moment to resolve those two.
No, it's not, no, I have no problems resolving that. If I am, listen, I have been extraordinarily transparent. There's more of my information out there than there probably has ever been with respect to the company that I work that employs 160,000 people in this great country. And so I'm proud of what I have disclosed for all of you to see and to make my salary history known in the course of disclosures. What I will say, and to be wholly consistent, not inconsistent, to be wholly consistent. I may have said that Donald Trump, as a Republican nominee, should disclose his taxes, and I have no problem doing that if I, in fact, am the Democratic nominee.
Ms. Teachout, a quick response to the earlier point.
Yeah, no, this is really, really important. I am the only candidate not taking corporate PAC money or LLC money. Yes, in New York, it is legal to do those things, but when you are running to be the New York State Attorney General responsible for investigating illegal behavior in big corporations, you should not be taking money from those corporations who you have oversight power over.
Thank you.
I have been outspoken in pushing to close the LLC loophole. I was cited in dissent in Citizens United. I have been an anti-corruption fighter my entire life. But we have a choice here. We all have a choice here today. Everybody has a choice about whether or not they are taking corporate PAC money. Everybody has a choice about whether they're taking LLC money, and I am not.
Well, to be clear, I have been on record since day one to champion the closure of the LLC loophole. But, you know, with all due respect, Ms. Teachout, to say that you don't take corporate money when in fact you have, when you've run 3 races in 4 years, that is not perseverance, that's political expediency, and that's not being straight with New York.
I think we need to move on to the next. The good news is the next question is also to you, Ms. Teachout. So this has been mentioned before, and I think it was mentioned by Mr. Maloney earlier. I did not hear a response, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to it. And maybe you think it's a major issue, maybe you think it's a frivolous point. But it's been raised by a number of people. You have run for a number of offices, governor, a seat in Congress, and now attorney general. You said at a recent debate, however, that this is the only job that you want. And you also emphasize, maybe more than any other candidate here, the importance of lawyering, of being a good lawyer as a qualification. And yet you didn't think to become a member of the relevant bar, the New York State Bar, until I think about 15 days ago. Why did you wait? Why did you wait till the end to obtain such a basic qualification?
I've been a lawyer for 17 years. I started my career as a death penalty lawyer in North Carolina, and I have been deeply involved in money in politics litigation, in strategic litigation around antitrust. And I brought suit against Donald Trump 3 days after he took office in the Southern District of New York. I appeared as recently as last October in the Southern District of New York. There is full reciprocity between North Carolina, where I initially got my bar license, and New York.
Right. Those are federal cases, correct?
Sorry?
Those were federal
Those
cases.
are federal cases, yes. There's full reciprocity between the two, and I am fully ready to lead this office in this anti-corruption crisis moment, both against the corruption of the Donald Trump administration and against the corruption we have in Albany. And one of the reasons that I have gotten this strong across-the-board support from the New York Times and the Daily News, from The Nation and the Buffalo News, from anti-corruption leaders and lawyers like Larry Tribe, is because I have the deep legal understanding and expertise of the precise laws that we need to use at this moment, at this truly terrifying moment in New York history.
Thank you very much. And I apologize to all of you who want to keep this going, but I want to make sure that we have time before the end of the debate for our other New York nonprofits to get their substantive questions in. So our next question comes from Yan Ko, fellow at the Century Foundation, who will ask a question first of Ms. James.
Thank you. Last year, the New York Attorney General investigated for-profit college DeVry University for defrauding students and reached a multi-million-dollar settlement. This year, a DeVry College dean is a senior advisor to Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. A lot can change in 1 year. With Trump and DeVos eliminating the guardrails on for-profit colleges, the Century Foundation has written about how students in New York are drowning in debt with worthless degrees from for-profit colleges. We will need more than a whack-a-mole enforcement approach to protect students in New York. If elected Attorney General, what would you do in your first year to go beyond enforcement and protect disadvantaged students from abuses by for-profit colleges?
I want to thank you for that question. As I mentioned earlier, the next crisis around the corner is servicers as well as student debt. Students across this state are facing, or across this nation, are facing trillions of dollars in debt, which is affecting their ability to accumulate wealth, particularly students of color. It's really critically important. What we are seeing really is a racial justice issue because individuals of color do not come from generational wealth and have a difficult time raising the funds, and oftentimes they have to seek out loans. And so as a result of the debt, it's obviously going to have a crisis. And what we are seeing now is the securitization of debt, where individuals are chopping up the debt and selling it into the market. And because of the high default rate, it's really critically important that the next Attorney General, again, use deceptive business practices, use the Martin Act to go after these individuals and to strengthen and harden the laws in the state of New York. But let me go back to the earlier question with respect to the question that was raised or that was asked of Ms. Teachout. One, the emoluments case that Ms. Teachout speaks of was dismissed. Two, she was not the attorney of record. Three, she did not get permission to be granted a status in the courts because she is an attorney of North Carolina. Three, when she was in North Carolina, she was sanctioned. Why? Because she abandoned a death row inmate to leave the state to join a campaign. Very true. All you have to do is go to North Carolina and read the censure and read the statement.
And forgive
last
me,
but not
I'm
least,
going to have...
she has, again, flip-flopped on the most important issue in the state of New York, and that is the SAFE Act. Why? Because she has previously said that she loves guns.
Jump in to keep this on the education question and keep it moving for time. But Ms. Teachout, in the rotation, you do get the next 1-minute response.
Okay, I now have time to respond first and then can answer her question?
Well, briefly, the question is education, but yes, you get a brief time to respond since you mentioned it.
I briefly want to be totally clear. I was not censured. In 2005, I failed to provide a forwarding address to the court. There was a $50 fee. I paid it. I took full responsibility. And I welcome you to read that document because it is very clear that there was no impact on the case or the client. So that is a simply false mischaracterization.
Because you were second seating the case and you were not the primary attorney. And you left
Ms.
the campaign
James,
to join
please.
a political campaign.
To answer this very critical question, I would use both the Martin Act and the Deceptive Practices Law in New York, both of which are incredibly powerful tools to go after illegality in the for-profit college industry and to protect students from scams and illegal behavior around debt. And this is particularly important. This is an area where this is bread and butter area of the New York State Attorney General's office, but it's particularly important understanding the federal context. There are basically 7 different consumer protection agencies right now at the federal level, including the CFPB, the FTC, the EPA, all of which in different ways are responsible for protecting consumers, all of which are currently being totally gutted by the Donald Trump administration. And so the role of the state attorneys general is greater than it has ever been in really being the regulator of last resort for basic consumer protection. This is an area where we are going to need to, is my time up? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Eve.
I have talked about education more than any other candidate in this race because I didn't grow up on a farm in Vermont. I was a product of the public school system in this state. And I had a quality basic education, and too many of our children do not. We have a Secretary of Education who does not believe in education. The most recent report showed that 99.9% of all complaints filed with the U.S. Department of Education with respect to universities, for-profit or not-profit, concern for-profit institutions. And now we have a Secretary of Education that wants to let them run amok. That's another reason why the Office of Attorney General is so important. So obviously I would use all the tools available at my disposal, and they're extraordinary, to hold any servicer who seeks to take New York students for a ride. But I welcome you to New York as a lawyer. But let me also say, a basic principle of a good New York litigator, Ms. Teachout, is that you do not walk out on your clients.
15-second response.
Again, this came up before. It's very clear. Welcome you to look at the record. And I'm really, really proud of the work I did representing people on death row. I learned a lot there. I learned from some of the best lawyers I have ever worked with about how to, when the train of the state is coming at your client, trying to kill your client, digging under every rock to find facts, digging under every legal rock to find new legal theories, and it is that spirit that I will bring as your next Attorney General.
Thank you.
New York
Mr.
State.
Maloney, one minute on the education question, please.
Yeah, listen, thank you for the question. It's enormously important. I do think, in the interest of clarity, the problem is not that Zephyr grew up in a farm in Vermont. But I'm trying to understand the moral. I'm trying to imagine the moral outrage that Professor Teachout would summon if Tish James had been cited for professional misconduct. And I don't think she would dismiss it so cavalierly, and she sure as hell wouldn't do it in a death penalty case. On education, the fact is that this is an issue that's raised probably more with me than any other issue as a member of Congress, because every mom and dad out there deals with this issue and worries about it. My folks send 5 of us to school on 1 income, and there's not a middle-class family in America that can send 1 kid to college on 2 incomes. So we should be refinancing every student loan down to 3%. We should be getting the privates out of this. We should allow forgiveness of student loan debt for national service. We should allow people to repay as a percentage of their income. And the most serious abuses happen with the service originators and the servicers of these loans. And it is absolutely the privates where we see the most misconduct. So you are right to focus on the actions of the Trump administration, where here, as in so many other areas, they are clearly trying to take us back to an era where people making money in this area can do what they want, and students will pay the price.
Can I follow up?
Thank you very much. No, because we have to make sure that we get, and I apologize, but we want to get our next question in before the clock runs out from Ndukwe Agwu, Interim Deputy Director of the Consumer and Economic Advocacy Program at Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A.
Thank you. My question is directed to you, Ms. Teachout. Economic inequality and the long-lasting effects of the Great Recession has placed many people underwater with their mortgages, credit cards, and living expenses. People who are under financial duress, seniors, immigrants, and low-wage working people, particularly in communities of color, are easy marks for criminals who want to separate people from their money and their homes. Reverse mortgage deed scams, exorbitant loans, fraudulent documentation, and other creative financing options are a constant problem here. But unlike big banks and financial institutions, those running such scams don't keep records and are hard to find. If elected, what will you do to improve the Attorney General's track record for protecting our most financially vulnerable?
Thank you for the question. It is the heart of the job. It is the heart of the job to make sure that the people of New York, not the wealthy, not the people with access, have the people's lawyer to represent them. And this is an area where we need to beef up the units, beef up the bureaus, because, again, of what's happening at the federal level, but also because of what is happening with the growing number of frauds online. I mean, we really are seeing a fraud crisis online right now. And pursuing those scams using General Business Law 347 is really, really critical. One area that I am really committed to is making sure that we have a greater presence in communities working with activists, because that's where you actually learn what's happening. Too often, scam artists, fancy scam artists who may, have a lot of lobbyist money and pay a lot of cash to campaigns, they rely on people not knowing their rights. The people don't know what they can do. And it is the job of the Attorney General to make sure that people know their rights, to be an organizer as well as the people's lawyer. This is another area where it is really important to not be taking corporate money so there's no conflict of interest in the job. Because the people that you're going to be investigating and pursuing are people who are often, in many cases, using LLCs to make financial contributions.
Thank you, Ms. Eve.
I think it's one of the most fundamental issues of our time, and I believe it starts first with receiving a sound basic education and having equal opportunities for education. I'm proud that my father, 51 years ago, as a rookie member of the Assembly, not with the party's support, created the legislation that founded the EOP and the HEOP program, through which more than 100,000, almost exclusively people of color, have gone on to college who otherwise might not have been able to go to in New York State. I would use every tool, and again, I understand New York law better than anyone on this stage, having worked for jurists on our state's highest court 28 years ago, but would use all the statutory powers I have to hold any person who's engaging, or any corporation that's engaging in deceptive practices, to account. I also believe we need to expand opportunities for minority and women-owned businesses. And after we legalize marijuana and expunge the records of every person who has a conviction for recreational use of marijuana, we ought to ensure the young people who have that conviction are able to participate in the marijuana industry. Those are just some of the ways that we need to ensure expanded educational and economic opportunities.
Mr. Maloney, 1 minute.
Right. Not sure how we get to marijuana decriminalization, but I support it. Seriously, it's very important, and I have a whole criminal justice reform agenda, and that's a big part of it. But I will tell you, one of the blessings about being in Congress is you get to actually see some people who come through your door and who have real problems, and you get to help them. And we've done 1,000 constituent cases one at a time every year out of my office for the last 6 years. And that means there are thousands of people who we have tried to do a little bit of good for, and that's the spirit I bring to this office. I'll tell you that one of the things I've done in this campaign is do 30 town halls in the last 30 days. I've done 150 town halls in Congress in my 5 years, and some of the best ones we do, sir, relate to simple scams, spreading information, telling seniors especially about what's happening out there. We bring experts into that phone call so that we are helping people to identify these things before they happen. It's not glamorous work, but it makes a huge difference in people's lives. And I'll tell you that this office has real power, particularly under the Medicaid Fraud Control Act, to get at wrongdoing in Medicaid-funded institutions. That's where a lot of abuses occur that really hurt people. And I think consumer protection and given a real priority to helping people who are victims of scams is at the heart of the job.
Ms. James.
We need to expand the Civil Rights Bureau and the Consumer Fraud Bureau of the Attorney General's office. We also need to make sure that we invest in legal services. You see, I've met with legal services already. I know a number of the issues from Buffalo to Long Island. And what they're telling me is there are issues on the ground of individuals who are being subjected to deed fraud and services who are exploiting the rights of individuals. And so I'm so glad that, Zephyr indicated that she didn't take LLC money, but she took funds from an individual hedge fund owner to the tune of $21,000. You see, I led the way on part of the NICE's board to divest from hedge fund managers. Why? Because they were investing in underperforming buildings, evicting rent control and rent stabilized tenants. And to me, that's unconscionable. In addition to that, I was part of the effort to raise the minimum wage in the state of New York. I was also part of the effort to focus on wage theft, joining with the labor unions, which is why 99% of the unions across the state of New York has endorsed my campaign. In addition to that, I banned salary history because I believe in equal pay for equal work should be more than a slogan.
Time, please. And Ms. Teachout, one more time, since you were mentioned by name and criticized, you get a short response.
Yeah, I have a very short response, which is that corporations are not people. And I have made a decision which has been joined by nobody else on this stage to not take any LLC money or corporate PAC money. And yes, there is a difference between people and corporations, and I think we all know that difference. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all
Thank you.
for that round. We have just a few minutes left in this debate, and so we will conclude with a short lightning round, short questions, yes or no answers, or short fill-ins where appropriate. Preet, you get the first question.
Okay. Please identify the author of the anonymous New York Times op-ed. Now, I know who it is. I just want to see if you know who it is. I've got a real question, and I'll read it quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But it's a quick answer, a yes/no answer. One thing that sticks in the craw of a lot of people is a bad actor's ability to settle a case by paying some fine, getting a tax write-off. With the benefit of the clause, we neither admit nor deny the allegations. The Trump University case that's been mentioned a bunch of times, somebody paid a $25 million fine, didn't admit any liability, didn't admit any facts, got a tax write-off and called it a day. We actually changed that practice in the Southern District in 2010, started requiring admissions of fact in basically every civil settlement, so it can be done. Do each of you commit to ending the practice of allowing bad actors to deny wrongdoing when resolving worthy lawsuits? Yes or no?
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes, because too many times defendants view even large fines as a cost of doing business.
Yes or no, or yes with an explanation?
Well, yes or no, because we don't have a lot of time.
Yes, and I believe the author of that. I
see we follow the rules.
Yeah, I believe the author of that op-ed is Melania Trump.
All right. Mr. Maloney or Ms. Teachout?
Professor Barara, the answer is yes.
Okay. Ms. Maloney, you going to make it 4?
Yes.
4 yeses. Great.
All right. Name one existing law other than a drug law that you would like to see changed to make New York a better place. Ms. Eve.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I believe strongly that we need to repeal 50A so that we have exponentially greater transparency with respect to the disciplinary records of law enforcement officers, particularly involving the death or injury of an unarmed civilian.
One law, Mr. Maloney.
We should have protection for a woman's reproductive freedom in New York, because we are watching right now a shameful exercise in Washington where they are plotting to undo it.
One law, Ms. James.
MCI increases preferential rent and vacancy decontrol.
One law, Ms. Teachout.
The next Attorney General of New York State needs full criminal and civil authority to investigate and prosecute corruption in Albany.
So the news today was that Ms. Teachout filed a lawsuit against one of the other candidates. So this question is just the two of you. Ms. James, Ms. Eve, does that lawsuit have any merit? Yes or no?
I haven't reviewed the lawsuit.
I'm not focused on the complaint filed to by this brand new New York lawyer, so no, I don't have a response. Yeah.
This will probably be the last question. Brett Kavanaugh says his role as a Supreme Court justice would be as a neutral umpire. Is the New York State Attorney General, Ms. James, a neutral umpire?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Is the New York State, would you say the New York State Attorney General is, in Brett Kavanaugh's words about Supreme Court justices, a neutral umpire?
No, not at all. Mr. Justice Kavanaugh represents a get-out-of-free jail card to Donald Trump.
Ms. Teachout.
The job is to represent the people of New York State tenaciously, vigorously, to the limits that one can. It is representation.
Ms. Eve.
The job of the Attorney General is to be the people's lawyer. It should put justice and fairness for all New Yorkers above all else.
And Mr. Maloney.
Can't top that.
And since we can't top that, with that, we want to thank the candidates for agreeing to this important and lively debate. We thank our substantive partners, Common Cause New York, the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, the Century Foundation, and the Consumer and Economic Advocacy Program at the Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A. We thank the Cooper Union, including President Laura Sparks and Trustees President Rachel Warren. Special thanks to WNYC producer Lisa Allison and WNYC technical wizard Ed Haber, and to producers Christine Reimert and Tim Marbach from Cooper Union. Everybody, don't forget to vote if you're registered in a party with a primary next Thursday. Yes, Thursday, September 13th. For Preet Bharara, host of the podcast Stay Tuned with Preet, I'm Brian Lehrer, host of The Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good night.